Building upon what we looked at in our previous lesson, we're going to take a look at how we can render out a depth of field pass and then use that for compositing purposes. Alright, so what we're about to look at does fall a little bit outside of the realm of what we would call mental ray, but it really does kind of build upon some of the concepts that we looked at in the previous lesson and kind of gives us a look at an alternative way of going about doing depth of field. So what we need to do in order to do any kind of post-process depth of field is we need to get some black and white information. Really some information about the depth of this scene. So what we need to do is a couple of things. Let's come into the actual material editor and give this just a second to load up. Let's pick an empty material slot and let's plug in a new self-illumination map. Alright, this is going to be just like what we did with the ambient reflective occlusion a few lessons previous, except this time we're going to plug in a fall-off map. Alright. So again, let's make sure that we call this something that we can recognize. We'll call this something like depth shader. Alright. Now let's take a look at this. Make sure that we do have this turned on. And we want to make sure again that our ambient and diffuse options are both turned off or both turned to black. So with the fall off type, let's take a look at a distance blend. Alright, so basically depth information. And we'll take a quick render of this. Actually, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. One thing that I need to do first is actually set up my material override. So let me go to the render setup. Alright, let's go back to this processing tab. We want to go to the material override and go to the material editor, and we want to plug in this depth shader. And we'll give it an instance. Now in this case, just like before, we don't need to have any kind of final gather, so we're welcome to come in and turn that off. And let's see what that gives us. You can see immediately our renders come back very, very quick. So let's come in and maybe start to dial some of these values up or down. Okay, let's see what this gives us. What we want to try to do is tighten up some of these values so that we get as much color information in here as possible. Alright, so that might work out for us. Okay, let's actually come down and start to bump up some of these near and far distances. That might give us a little bit more control over this. There we go, that's actually what I'm looking for. So let's start to increase some of this near distance, and we'll try to get something that is just a little bit in front of this frontmost teapot here. And from there we can start to kind of dial this back as far as we need in order to start to get a little bit more information in here. In this case, that's probably a little bit too high, so let's maybe start to bring that down. That's probably a little bit too low, so we'll try to find something kind of in the middle. I want to try to get this to where it cuts off just before it gets to the end of this ground plane. Alright, so once we have this, we can actually render this out and then save this as its own pass or its own image. Alright, so once we have that rendered out and saved, we can start to use any of our compositing applications to start to bring this together as depth information. Now, again, I'm going to be using Photoshop for this, but really just about any compositing application does have the ability to look at this luminance depth information. So what we first need to do is to take advantage of the actual plugin that we're going to use in Photoshop is we need to get this black and white information into the alpha channel of this image, because the plugin that we're going to use, the alpha channel, is the first place it's going to look for this depth information. So we can copy this, and I'll just paste it right here into the alpha. So here's this black and white information. Now a lot of times what I try to do, just to avoid some of these unusual harsh edges, these can sometimes cause a little bit of problem, is we can come in and maybe just give this a little bit of a blur, maybe 2 or 3 pixels. We'll see what that does for us. Alright, so that just kind of blurs this alpha channel a little bit. but our color information is still the same, just like we need it. So now, with this layer chosen, let's go to Filter, and we're going to go to Blur, down to Lens Blur. Alright, there we go. Get that resized in there. So what we can do with this lens blur is first define some kind of a depth map source. We have a few to choose from. In our case, since we pasted the information into the alpha channel, that's the first place we'll tell it to look. And here, now we can just use that color information. It's now going to be referring to that to choose which areas are going to be blurred more or less. So we have the radius, which controls how much of this blur is going to happen. So you can see higher radius, more blur gets introduced. Now, because this is kind of a blurring trick, it isn't 100% accurate, and it especially becomes apparent whenever we really start to crank up this blur radius. You can start to see how we introduce a little bit of kind of unusual artifacting. We kind of have these strange edges around our object. So this is one of these effects that it's very good, but you do want to try to use it kind of sparingly. Now, what we can do is also start to increase things kind of like this brightness threshold. So as we start to dial this up or down, we should now start to introduce a few more of these kind of bright spots in here. Kind of introduce a little bit of that kind of a glare, kind of a flare that we usually get. You can even start to see a little bit of that happening back here as well. So as we start to increase this focal distance, you see we can actually change the areas that are going to be blurred. But actually, I find it to be a little bit easier. If you're here inside this little window, you can actually just click on the area that you want to become focused, and there you go. Now again, because this is kind of a trick, you do start to see a little bit of kind of a halo, or a little bit of a soft edge around here, so it doesn't always work 100%, but a lot of times it will give you pretty close to the results that you need. If you find that it is maybe giving you kind of some of these odd results, a lot of times I find it to be useful to just kind of dial back that radius, and then a lot of times that will kind of alleviate the problem for you. But you can see how this is much faster than actually doing the motion blur or the depth of field blur in Max. You can see we have much more control, it's much cleaner, and it overall renders out much faster. So that's just an idea of some of the things that we can start to do with our different passes to start to incorporate things like this depth of field.